911, where's your emergency?
I'm up here to my daughter's house up in Cemetery Hill, and my own grandson is dead, and my daughter and her husband are in the bed, and I swear everywhere in there. I'm not touching nothing.
Sir, how many people's deceased?
It looks like 3. I can't find my other 2. There's a 3-year-old and my 16-year-old. I don't know where they're at.
Timothy? You have any idea who could have done this?
No.
Have there been any, like, family issues? I mean, anything like that going on between any of them?
They were having some trouble out of Gavin. Issues with as far as, like, his temperament and he's running around or running away. A lot had to do with that girl that he was running. She's a fruitcake.
Gavin. So I'm Detective Crawford. That's Detective Officer with the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office. First name's Adam. Okay, but we want to talk to you because obviously there are people hurt, dead at your house, and we want to talk to you about it.
I called police. I used to hang out with them all the time.
When Gavin's talking to the police, he never asks about the well-being or welfare of his family. He's trying to present himself as a nice kid, somebody who wants to help them in whatever way is possible, that he's going to be cooperative. And really what those are his superficial and somewhat elementary attempts at manipulating them.
When did Gavin get here?
A couple days ago.
Okay. So, a couple days ago being today's Sunday. What day was he up here? What day did he get here?
I don't know the exact date, but it was about 5 days, I think. Well, today would have been the 5th day.
How could that be? Mama was here. She just left Friday. How could he dip her for 5 days? Did Mama know he was up here?
No, she didn't.
I'm trying to understand. You said he's been up for 5 days. How can that be?
You want to know the truth?
I do want to know the truth.
I know. Sorry. I know that you don't like him. I know that, but he's the only person that's really helped me through stuff. And look, I know it makes me. I know it's stupid. Okay, I know it, but he's the only person that makes me feel like I'm not alone, because you guys made me feel like I'm alone. He's the only person that made me feel like I was something.
As Rebecca becomes more emotional and starts to talk more directly to her father, what we learn is that she's a teenager who's struggling. She's lonely, she's depressed, and Rebecca is clinging to this relationship because in her mind and in her teenage perspective on the world, Gavin's it.
What's amazing is that something absolutely horrible has happened. People have been brutally murdered, and her takeaway is that it's all about her. You guys did not make me feel special. He made me feel special. And there we begin to see the Romeo and Juliet story start to come together.
I know the answer to this, and so do you. But did he open up and tell you what he did?
Yes.
Good. What did he tell you? Did he say he shot him?
Yes.
What would drive him to do this stuff? Is it because he loved you so much?
Yes.
lives with the house with you?
My mom, my stepdad, my baby brother, and my younger brother.
Okay, what are all their names?
Gage is the youngest. Well, not the youngest, younger brother. James is the baby. Dan is the stepdad, and mom is the Weezer.
Okay.
All ISA. I can't pronounce how it's right.
We get introduced to Smith, and we find out a few things about him. Obviously, he has some sort of speech impediment, which in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean anything in terms of his intellectual or cognitive functioning, but can have significant repercussions in terms of his social life, in terms of how he was treated by fellow classmates.
And when he's asked about the people in his family, he talks about them in the third person. This is the baby, this is the stepfather, and this is the mother, as if he's talking about a story. Something outside his own family. There's no real attachment. There's just no emotion coming from this teenager.
Some of your family members are deceased. Okay. You know what that means? They're dead, right?
Yes, sir.
The detective is very clever. He says, some of your family members are dead. He doesn't say all. We never hear Smith say, who? Who's dead? Who's alive? He doesn't ask any of those questions, which is very odd. Not so odd if he knows the answer.
So what we're wanting is to get the truth from you about what happened at your house and how your family ended up dead, okay?
Dad, I don't know, but I know about the abuse.
Huh?
I said I didn't know about the season, but I know about the abuse. My stepdad used to abuse me all the time if I didn't do something he wanted. And so would my mom.
He's not answering the question at all. He's front-loading his answer with excuses to try to justify what he's done. So that right there shows calculated thinking. He's thinking to try to reduce his culpability, and that's very psychopathic.
My stepdad, Dan, has been trying to kill me the past few days. He cut me right there.
Okay.
With a knife. And he's been just trying to kill me wherever he can.
Despite the fact that he knows his stepfather and mother and brothers have been dead for this period of time, he's saying that for the past 2 days, his stepfather's tried to kill him. He points to a place where he was sliced on his arm, and there's no real wound there. Gavin is not worried about fact-checking. He's not worried about the credibility of what he's saying. Some of that we see in teenagers in general. They kind of engage in this magical thinking. But some of this is also consistent with what we see in psychopathic individuals who compulsively or pathologically lie.
Tell me about Daniel. What kind of guy was he?
He loved them boys. He loved racing. He was one of the nicest guys you'd ever meet. I loved him to death. Dan was supposed to have a heart transplant.
Okay.
So he was only limited to what he could do because he couldn't get around, didn't have much wind.
I wonder why Gavin would be so angry to hurt Dan recently.
Unless he come and asked them to go up there, see her, and they would have told him no. And it broke her heart. All the times that Gavin would run away. Nobody understood why, but it always come back to that girl.
Let's start with Gavin.
Well, he didn't really like going to class. He was very childlike, very immature. He was not a typical ninth grader in, behavior-wise. He didn't seem to have a ton of friends. You know, that's the biggest thing with him. He lacked social skills.
What the teacher describes here is really cements the fact that Smith was marginalized. He didn't like going to school because I'm sure school was a difficult place. His speech impediment set him up to be the target of horrific bullying. So that, again, is fueling this anger. Now, this profile that's coming out of this picture begins to look like the profile of a school shooter. of someone who at some point is going to snap and want retribution against everyone for all the harm he feels he's suffered.
Did you have any issues with her?
She just didn't do a lot of work. When she did do an assignment, it was always centered around a boy. I mean, from my observation of her, it seemed like she was all about, you know, whatever boy she was with at the time. Kind of obsessed.
The big thing that stands out to me is that she describes Walker as a boy-obsessed individual, and it seems like Walker's self-esteem, self-identity, and self-worth were very tied to a man's perception of her or whether or not she had a romantic partner.
Well, Gavin, what we're getting at is we talked to Rebecca, and you told Rebecca that she killed your family, okay?
I don't regret it.
You regret it?
No.
Who'd you shoot first?
Dan.
Okay. Where'd you shoot Dan?
In the head. I expected Mom in the head. Mom, Dan was in bed when I shot them.
Where was everybody else when you shot them?
Gage's, before I shot Gage, he went into their room and I shot him right down. And I had to kill Jay because Gage slit his throat right now.
Gage slit his throat? Why did Gage slit James?
Because he kept on screaming. James kept on screaming, he won't calm down. And Gage couldn't take it, and he put a knife to James' throat and tried to slit it, and I shot Gage right there.
Okay. Well, why'd you shoot James?
I can't really do it, but I didn't like seeing him in pain. I was at his crib when I shot him.
When Smith talks about how he killed his entire family, he does it as though he was describing what he had for breakfast. It's completely devoid of any of the associated emotions that you would expect.
And when we think about psychopathic individuals, oftentimes there's a lack of remorse, there's a lack of guilt, there's a willingness to just blame others, to stay superficial in their emotions and their attachment.
Well, Gavin, I don't think Gage cut Jameson's throat. I think you did.
I might have messed up though. I'm not thinking straight. Gage didn't have to change, so I'm sorry.
Well, why did you tell us that to begin with?
I got messed up.
That Gavin Smith just kind of rolls over and he flip-flops on his story and pretty immediately says, I got mixed up. I was the one that did all of this. There was nothing that Gavin Smith got mixed up about. He was quite clear and focused, and so much so that he shot 3 of the family members in the head, point blank, and then went to his baby brother's room, slit his throat, and then shot him in the head.
Did you tell anybody about what you were planning to do?
Well, I told Rebecca. I told her I was going to kill them.
How long from when he showed up to when he actually told you what went down?
Well, he didn't tell me like when he got here. We was texting and all that, and he was FaceTiming. I knew that he was doing it. He had his gun in his hand.
And did he tell you why he was going to kill all of them? His reason?
His parents didn't like me for whatever reason. He wanted to just get rid of them so he could be with me.
This clip is incredibly disturbing in terms of showing us a glimpse of Rebecca Walker's mindset. She saw his hand on the gun as this was happening and yet did nothing to intervene. So White Why would that be? Is she so frightened? Didn't seem that way. Could she have gone to the police? Of course. Could she have told her grandmother? Absolutely. But she tells you why at the end of the clip. Because she wanted him to be with her. And what greater power there is than to know that someone kills for you. So clearly, now Romeo and Juliet have become Bonnie and Clyde.
At any point, do you recall ever encouraging Gavin to hurt his family? Did you ever tell him to just blatantly say, Gavin, I want you to hurt or kill your family?
I did encourage it, yes, I did.
Was that in regard to specifically his stepdad and mom or everyone, or what did you mean when you said that?
Everyone.
And by everyone, you mean?
His whole family. I was saying to hurry up. That's what I was saying.
Why were you telling him to do that?
Because I wanted me and him to spend time together.
She not only knew about it, but she encouraged him to kill every member of his family. So we get a very, very disturbing picture of a young woman who feels that it's so important for her to be loved that she's willing to be complicit in multiple murders in order to prove that. Maybe she even kind of weaponized him. Maybe she was able to push him over the edge to do what she needed for her own self-esteem. He had nothing left, and yet she had all of him, and that's all she wanted. And that kind of thought process can only be described as psychopathic.
Last night you explained that you guys were basically, talking about killing his family for a whole entire week. So what started at the beginning of that week to make him start talking about that, or you start suggesting?
I have no idea. Other than him telling me that he was tired of his family keeping us from being together and he wanted to hurt them. He was tired of the abuse he was going through and he wanted to be with me. And that's why he wanted to do it.
What's really important to realize here is in Walker's own interrogation, she's not showing any emotions. She's not showing any concern for.
911, where's your emergency?
I've been getting calls from my mother-in-law. My wife's not picking up the phone.
What's her name?
Jackie Wallace. I called her a bunch of times.
Okay, when's the last time you seen her?
Well, we got out of the lawyer today. We're going through a divorce, and I don't know if she's just not in.
Okay, where was she headed?
Home, I think. I mean, this ain't like her to go this long without following me.
When was the last time you saw her?
We went to lunch, and then we went to the lawyer at 3.
Tell me what time she actually left here.
I don't know. We got in an argument over this bankruptcy. It wasn't bad.
Okay. Did she say where she was going?
She took off walking.
Okay.
I've never seen her after that. Her car was gone.
Y'all got any kids together?
Yeah, we got triplets. 2 girls and a boy. Her parents are not right.
Did they talk to you?
Oh my God, trust me.
Okay.
Threaten me, all kinds of stuff.
Okay. You know the address there?
No, sir.
Okay.
Despite being law enforcement himself previously, Clay Waller didn't bother to call dispatch until he receives pressure from Jackie's family. Waller's lack of concern or urgency for locating his estranged wife, the mother of his triplets, who are only 5 years old, just makes his overall behavior suspicious.
So she left off on foot. Did you go try to look for her in your car then?
Yeah, I went down the hill. I didn't see her, and I went and got a soda to cool off.
My dad's a shady person. He always has been. I know he's going bankrupt. I know she was supporting him. If something bad happened, I think my dad did it. That's what I came in here to tell you guys.
Who's your dad's best friend?
My dad don't have no friends.
You've got to have somebody.
He has nobody.
What his son is starting to paint for us is a picture of somebody with a parasitic lifestyle mix where you're using other people. You're willing to live off of other people, and there's no real sense of adult responsibility or conscience to take care of yourself, to have a sense of integrity.
39-year-old Jackie Waller, formerly of Cape Girardeau, was last seen here on Woodland Drive in North Neal in Jackson.
Dozens of officers are now working this case. No one believes that this mother of three would just walk away from her children.
Wednesday, March 23rd, Clay called me at 7 a.m. He was threatening me and yelling at me. Met him at the airport. He told me that divorcing him was a death sentence. He would get me, and if he couldn't get to me, he would kill our kids. So, in this excerpt, you can see that there's just no regard for his having any real genuine affection for his own children. And just like all the characters in a psychopath's life, they're not other people who have feelings and interests and the ability to feel pain or anything else. They're simply characters in the story as they relate to the psychopath. And it's striking that even his young children that he later claims he cares so much about actually appear as just pawns for him to use as suits him in a particular situation.
When we look at journal entries like this, I think what this speaks to is a pattern of coercive, emotional abuse, physical threats, and he is doing what so many domestic abusers do. When they can't get to their partner, they use the children as a weapon, and they threaten to harm the children.
A new development in the Jackie Waller case. Investigators searching her estranged husband's rental have discovered blood spatter on 2 walls and that carpet had been removed.
The media's doing quite a number on me.
We need to hear from you is what we need to do. We need your cooperation.
I'm going to tell the story after it's all said and done. I'll tell it. What story? But until then, I'm just going to...
What story?
I'm going to just keep my mouth shut. I don't have nothing to do with it. I haven't done anything.
Okay. Explain the carpet, Clay. Explain Jackie's blood on the walls. Explain that to me right now. Hello? Clay?
Clay Waller says the community's out to get him. People spray painting killer on his truck.
I mean, it's been a hard time for us all.
Carpet and carpet pad hidden out of view in the back of a crawl space. One piece had a large blood stain that the crime lab confirmed contained Jackie Waller's DNA.
Clay, do you
have any comment?
He was arrested in Malden, Missouri on charges not related to his estranged wife's disappearance. He now faced a charge of stealing from a Cape Girardeau company and also a harassment charge.
I'm not in here trying to trick you. I'm not in here trying to play games. I'm trying to talk to you man to man. I think something's happened there. I can't tell you. I don't know where she's at.
They haven't yet found enough evidence to actually charge him with anything. And in his mind, as former law enforcement, without a body, what are they going to charge him with? So he just continues to taunt them. It's quite possible that this cat and mouse game isn't just Clay's hope to keep himself out of trouble. There's a secondary euphoria he's getting by thinking he's in charge. He's smarter than them.
I think his body language is telling. He's almost like stretched out, owning the entire interrogation room. He wants to show, I'm in control. You may think this is your interrogation, but really, I'm the one who's deciding which way we go.
I'm scared bloody no. It wasn't anything more than that. That doesn't make sense. It happened. It happened. Because you have blood in the hall on the wall. How's that going to happen? That don't make any sense either, Clay. I don't know.
When he's confronted about the biological evidence, he doesn't even miss a beat. He doesn't hesitate to just insert another lie. If she had a nosebleed, if she tripped and hurt herself, why would you cut out the carpet in a rental? And then on top of that, he very covertly hid it so that it would be out of line of sight for anybody if they came through the house. Every step of the way, he has done what he can to hide and obstruct the process. His need for power and control and his narcissistic views of things far supersede any fear response he may have. And that's something we do see oftentimes in psychopathic individuals.
Cutting the carpet out? Yeah, it was kind of good. The cop said I can clean up the house. You can clean up, but that's not cleaning up. That's hiding something. I didn't do that. Then why not? Let me take the call. Does it clear me after that? If you can't make that promise, why does it have to be a promise? Is it about you or is it about Jack? Is it about you or is it about your kids? What is it about you? Is it only about you? Don't get upset. We can end the conversation. You ought to be happy that I get upset. My main concern is for Jack. Well, go find her. What I'm trying to do right here, buddy. I don't know where she's at. And you're never going to get it out of me. Never going to get it out of me. That would never be the answer. Why are you lying to me? I'm not. Yeah. You are. You know you are, and I know you are. If you guys know so much, figure it out. I don't know what to tell you. I have nothing to do with nothing. You think you're really a lot smarter than you are.
Light at the end of the tunnel is going out for you. We're coming for you. And we're not going to rest. We don't need a body.
I don't give a get in jail.
We're going to lock you up the rest of your life. What we're going to do to you. Great. Huh? Great. Yeah, you narcissistic bastard. That's why you think about yourself.
Nothing to do with that.
On Thursday morning, Clay Waller appeared in court regarding the alleged death threats he made to Jackie Waller's sister, Cheryl Brinicki, on the website Topics.
Jackie's sister got custody of the children, the triplets. So I think that what this represents is that Jackie's sister has basically become a proxy for Jackie. The narcissistic traits in psychopaths, you know, if they experience kind of anything that threatens their feeling of mastery, it's going to trigger anger, and they're prone to lash out with violence, with threats, things like that. This specific dynamic of someone is going to take the children away from me, that sets him off, and he directs thoughts of violence toward that person. So for the longest time, it was Jackie. Jackie's out of the picture. This is a very kind of clear substitute.
Waller has not been charged in connection with his wife's disappearance.
She's still missing, and our first and foremost priority is to find her.
Waller's parents just want their daughter found, especially for the sake of her 3 children, who turn 6 next month.
It's gone on so long. We want there to be an end to it because it's so hard not to know.
He's doing things to enjoy that arousal of being in charge. And particularly with somebody who's a domestic violence perpetrator, that need for control is far more intense than it is for most of us. And so it's important to realize that at this point, because we know after the fact that Clay has killed Jackie, he's hidden her body, nobody knows where it is, he's got to get that thrill-seeking, that arousal from somewhere. So continuing to jerk the police around is how he does that.
Waller pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, a lesser charge.
You'll be remanded to the custody of the Missouri Department of Corrections to serve a term of 20 years of imprisonment.
Clay Waller led investigators here to Devil's Island in Alexander County, Illinois, where they dug up Jackie Waller's remains.
In return, Mr. Waller had to provide the location of Jackie Waller's body, sit down, and give an accounting of how he killed Jackie Waller.
I was very calm. And I said, if you take those kids from me, Jack, I'm going to kill you. And I'm just going to rest my life in jail, just like that. My wife came to me in December. She said, I want a divorce. At that point in time, I wasn't concerned about her. Because I knew ultimately if she got those kids to where they were away from me, it was over. I knew it was over. And then she came in about May 1st and she said, I want to go and get a divorce. I said, okay. I knew you was going to die as soon as you did it.
So June 1st, you had your discussion with your attorney.
Her attorney. We get outside and she's like, you want to have one last bang before we make this final. I'm like, yeah, it's going to be a bang over there.
All right. So then what happened?
And she went to the refrigerator. I shot in there to get a Reese's peanut butter cup. I raised up and I hit her nose. She started bleeding. And she took off running. And she tripped. And she tripped it. And she made off the cuff and mark. She said, I need to go tell the attorney that you just beat me up. I'm like, beat you up? Face. I stood over and I punched her right in the nose. She started bleeding profusely. And then she was starting to thrash around. She just like, this hurts. And then blah, blah, blah. So I just took my forearm. Just pressed into her neck. And she stopped moving.
Essentially, he states that it was Jackie's fault that she was killed. He said, I warned her, as if a threat that he acted on to kill her is in any way valid. But on top of that, he explains how he looked her in the eye as he was killing her, and he just didn't feel anything bad because he warned her, and so he's absolved of any type of guilt or responsibility.
She was too heavy to move. So then I went, there was a trash can sitting right here. And I load her in that trash can. And then I take it out and I take it over here.
Okay, so you put the can containing Jackie in the back of your truck?
Yeah.
He had just committed murder and his wife was now dead. The children that he has with her are now motherless, and he's complaining about her body being too heavy. Even then, he's saying it in such a way that the only real emotion he shows is for himself.
I got the boat out, which was difficult because it was mud and water was not very deep.
Okay, and you go up the river? It's on the Illinois side, just south of Devil's Island Chute.
Yeah.
What day did you dig the hole that you buried her in?
The day before.
The day before, so May 31st.
Very gently pulled her out, placed her in the hole, and I told her I just always I wanted was my family. Or something along those lines. That's what I told her.
While Waller is describing the details of what actually happened the day he killed Jackie, there are moments where he sounds like it was this impulsive act, but he dug the hole before. He knew she signed her death warrant the minute she didn't back down on the divorce.
There are nights that disappear quietly into history, remembered only by the people who lived through them. Then there are nights that refuse to fade, nights that leave a permanent scar on an entire city. In the early hours of April 15, 2014, a quiet neighborhood in Calgary, Canada, was supposed to be asleep. The streets of Brentwood looked exactly as they always had. Neatly trimmed lawns rested beneath the cold spring sky. Porch lights glowed softly against rows of family homes. A gentle breeze drifted through bare tree branches that had only just begun to wake after another long Canadian winter. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested that, before sunrise, it would become the scene of the deadliest mass murder in Calgary's modern history. Inside one ordinary house on Butler Crescent, laughter had carried late into the evening. University students were celebrating the end of another semester. Some talked about final exams that were finally behind them. Others joked about summer jobs, graduation plans, road trips, and everything that felt possible when youth still stretched endlessly ahead. Empty pizza boxes sat beside half-finished drinks. Shoes had been kicked off near the front entrance. Music had played in the background for hours before gradually becoming quieter as conversations broke into smaller groups. No one believed they were making memories that would become their last. No one imagined that among the familiar faces was a young man whose own mind was beginning to fracture in ways invisible to everyone around him. When investigators later reconstructed the timeline, they discovered something unsettling. There had been no argument. No screaming match. No obvious conflict. No warning that anyone at the party recognized. That absence of warning would become one of the most haunting parts of the entire case. Because evil often leaves clues. Anger leaves footprints. Revenge usually announces itself long before violence begins. But on this night, the danger did not arrive from hatred in the ordinary sense. It emerged from somewhere far more confusing. Far more frightening. Somewhere inside a human mind losing its grip on reality. Long before police officers surrounded the neighborhood. Long before flashing emergency lights painted the quiet streets in red and blue. Long before detectives counted victims inside a home that had hosted a celebration only hours earlier. Something had already begun unfolding inside one person's thoughts. A silent collapse. One that almost nobody saw. One that even those closest to him struggled to understand afterward. Across Canada, millions of people would eventually hear the name Brentwood 5. For many, it became shorthand for unimaginable violence. For grieving families, it became a date forever etched into calendars that would never again be ordinary. For mental health professionals, it became one of the country's most discussed examples of how severe psychosis can alter perception so completely that reality itself becomes unrecognizable. And for the justice system, it forced painful questions that still spark debate years later. How should society respond when a person commits unimaginable violence while experiencing profound mental illness? Can justice exist when intention itself becomes blurred by delusion? Can families ever find peace when there is no conventional motive to confront? Those questions would dominate courtrooms, newspaper headlines, television debates, and dinner table conversations for years. But before any of those questions could be asked, 5 young people were still alive. 5 families still believed tomorrow would arrive exactly as planned. 5 futures still existed. Jordan Segura was looking toward the next chapter of adulthood. Lawrence Hong had ambitions that reached beyond the classroom. Joshua Hunter was surrounded by friends who believed there would always be another gathering. Zachariah Rathwell carried the kind of energy that makes people remember a room long after someone has left it. Katie Perez had dreams that would never have the chance to become memories. None of them knew that the ordinary decisions made that evening would become the final moments of their lives. The tragedy of this case is not only measured by the number of lives lost. It is measured by its complete unpredictability. Many true crime stories begin with warning signs that become obvious in hindsight. Threats ignored. Obsessions dismissed. Relationships poisoned by years of resentment. Financial desperation. Carefully planned revenge. This story refuses to fit comfortably into any of those familiar patterns. Instead, it forces us into territory where certainty disappears. It asks us to examine the terrifying possibility that catastrophic violence can emerge not from calculated malice, but from a mind overwhelmed by beliefs that bear no resemblance to reality. That distinction changes nothing for the victims. It changes nothing for the parents who would receive phone calls before dawn. It changes nothing for siblings who would spend years wondering whether one small decision could somehow have changed the outcome. Yet it changes everything when trying to understand why this happened. As daylight eventually rose over Calgary that April morning, police officers found themselves confronting a crime scene unlike anything the city had experienced in generations. Veteran investigators who had spent decades responding to violent crimes would later describe the scale of the tragedy as almost impossible to process. The victims were young. The gathering had been peaceful. The suspect had not fled across provinces or disappeared into the wilderness. He had simply walked away. When officers located him only a short distance from the house, he offered little resistance. There was no dramatic chase. No exchange of gunfire. No attempt to escape the consequences that had already begun reshaping countless lives. Instead, the investigation would soon move in a direction few expected. Questions about fingerprints and forensic evidence quickly expanded into questions about psychiatry, delusions, hallucinations, and the fragile boundary between criminal responsibility and profound mental illness. Those questions remain uncomfortable because they resist simple answers. It is tempting to divide the world neatly between monsters and ordinary people. Reality is rarely so accommodating. This story is not an attempt to excuse what happened. Nor is it an attempt to reduce 5 vibrant lives to a legal debate. Their lives mattered long before the headlines appeared. Their families loved them long before television cameras arrived outside the house on Butler Crescent. And they deserve to be remembered as far more than names connected to one terrible morning. Over the course of this story, we will return to that spring night in Calgary. We will walk through the ordinary hours before everything changed. We will examine the lives that were interrupted without warning. We will follow investigators as they searched for answers inside one of Canada's most heartbreaking criminal cases. And we will confront the difficult questions that still linger more than a decade later. Because sometimes the most disturbing mysteries are not about identifying who committed the crime. Sometimes we know that almost immediately. The real mystery is understanding how a seemingly ordinary evening transformed into a tragedy that would forever change a city, challenge a justice system, and leave 5 families carrying a grief that no verdict could ever erase. This is the story of the Brentwood 5. The city of Calgary has always carried 2 identities at once. To many people around the world, it is known for the Calgary Stampede, towering office buildings, and the vast Canadian Rockies rising beyond the western horizon. It is a city where modern skylines meet open prairie, where long winters shape everyday life, and where communities are built around the quiet expectation that neighbors look after one another. In the spring of 2014, Calgary was home to more than 1 million people. It was growing rapidly, attracting students, professionals, and families from across Canada and around the world. Despite its size, there remained neighborhoods where children still rode bicycles through quiet streets, where porch lights stayed on late into the evening, and where unfamiliar cars were often noticed simply because they stood out. One of those neighborhoods was Brentwood. Located in the city's northwest, Brentwood had earned a reputation as one of Calgary's most established residential communities. Mature trees lined its streets, modest family homes sat behind carefully maintained lawns, and the neighborhood balanced two very different rhythms of life. During the day, many residents were families who had lived there for decades. They walked their dogs along peaceful sidewalks, tended their gardens, and exchanged friendly greetings with neighbors they had known for years. But another population gave Brentwood a different energy. Just minutes away stood the University of Calgary. Every academic year, thousands of students arrived from different provinces and countries, bringing with them ambitions, uncertainty, excitement, and the restless optimism that often defines early adulthood. Some lived in university residences, while others rented nearby houses with friends, transforming ordinary suburban homes into shared spaces filled with textbooks, late-night conversations, empty coffee cups, and plans for futures that still felt limitless. The house on Butler Crescent was one of many such homes. From the outside, it looked entirely unremarkable. Its walls did not hint at tragedy. Its windows reflected only neighboring houses and the changing Alberta sky. It was simply another student rental where young adults balanced classes, part-time jobs, friendships, and the everyday chaos of university life. Inside, life followed a familiar pattern. Bedrooms were personalized with posters, laptops, laundry baskets, and stacks of textbooks. The kitchen became the center of countless conversations. Someone was almost always preparing food, rushing out the door, or returning home after a long day on campus. Like many shared student houses, perfection was never the goal. The furniture had seen better days. The couches carried the unmistakable signs of countless movie nights and study sessions. There were shoes scattered near the entrance and coffee mugs that somehow always accumulated beside the sink. To outsiders, it might have looked ordinary. To the people living there, it felt like home. Spring had finally begun pushing winter aside. In Calgary, April often carries uncertainty. Snow can disappear one day and return the next. Cold mornings gradually surrender to brighter afternoons, while evenings remain crisp enough for jackets. Students understand that this season marks more than changing weather. It signals the closing chapter of another academic year. Final examinations dominate conversations. Libraries remain crowded late into the night. Coffee shops fill with exhausted students reviewing lecture notes one last time. Stress becomes almost universal, yet beneath that pressure exists another feeling. Relief. The end is finally visible. Plans for summer slowly replace discussions about assignments. Some students prepare to travel home. Others begin internships or full-time work. Some are graduating, stepping toward careers that have occupied their dreams for years. That mixture of exhaustion and optimism creates a unique atmosphere across every university campus. The University of Calgary was no different. Its walkways filled each day with students carrying backpacks heavy with textbooks while imagining a future just beyond graduation. Some had only recently met classmates who would become lifelong friends. Others were preparing to say goodbye to people they might never see again after commencement. University life has always been defined by impermanence. People enter each other's lives unexpectedly. They share apartments, classes, celebrations, disappointments, and ordinary moments that seem insignificant at the time. Years later, those moments become memories far more valuable than anyone realized while living them. That reality made the events of April 2014 especially heartbreaking. The people gathered that evening were not strangers connected by coincidence. They were classmates, friends, roommates, people whose lives had become intertwined through the everyday experiences of young adulthood. Many had spent countless evenings together before, ordering pizza, watching hockey, laughing over stories from class, complaining about exams, celebrating birthdays, making plans that stretched months and years into the future. Nothing about the gathering itself was unusual. There was no lavish celebration. No major event drawing large crowds. Simply a group of young adults enjoying the rare opportunity to relax after weeks of academic pressure. For university students, these moments often become the emotional reward at the end of a demanding semester. The conversations tend to drift effortlessly from serious to ridiculous. One minute someone discusses career goals. The next, everyone bursts into laughter over an embarrassing story from first year. Time seems slower in those environments. The future feels generous. There is always another semester. Another weekend. Another chance to reconnect. Perhaps that is why stories like this resonate so deeply. They remind us how quickly ordinary life can be interrupted. Not because ordinary life is fragile every single day, but because we rarely recognize its value until it is gone. Among the people connected to this story was 22-year-old Matthew DeGrood. Before his name appeared in headlines across Canada, he was known very differently. He had grown up in Calgary in a family familiar with public service. His father was a respected senior officer with the Calgary Police Service, a detail that would later attract enormous media attention once the tragedy unfolded. To many observers, that fact created an immediate contradiction. How could the son of a senior police officer become the central figure in one of the city's darkest criminal cases? At first glance, it seemed impossible. But human lives are rarely defined by appearances alone. Those who knew Matthew described someone who had interests, friendships, and ambitions much like many other young adults. He had attended university and maintained social connections within student circles. There was little to suggest that he would soon become associated with one of Canada's most devastating acts of violence. Yet beneath the surface, investigators would later learn that something far more complicated had been developing. Not overnight. Not in a single dramatic moment. Mental illness often refuses dramatic introductions. Its earliest signs can be subtle. A change in behavior. Growing isolation. Confusion that seems temporary. Thoughts that become increasingly difficult to organize. Sometimes these changes are recognized early and treated successfully. Sometimes they remain misunderstood, dismissed as stress, anxiety, or the ordinary pressures of early adulthood. Only later, when viewed through the lens of tragedy, do scattered moments begin to resemble warning signs. What made this case especially difficult was that many of those closest to Matthew did not recognize the severity of what was happening before April 15. The catastrophic break from reality identified after the killings was not understood beforehand by the people around him. That distinction would become central throughout the investigation and later during the court proceedings. At the same time, life continued normally for everyone else. Students hurried across campus without realizing history was quietly approaching. Parents spoke with their children over the phone, discussing exams and summer plans. Friends arranged gatherings without imagining that one invitation would become part of a national tragedy. The city itself remained unaware. Traffic moved through downtown. Restaurants welcomed evening customers. Police officers responded to ordinary calls across Calgary. Hospitals treated patients. Buses carried commuters home. Nothing suggested that, before dawn, every major newsroom in Canada would be reporting from the same quiet residential street. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of every tragedy lies in the final hours before it begins. Those hours never appear remarkable while they are unfolding. People smile without realizing it will become the last photograph. Someone promises to call tomorrow. Another says goodnight without knowing those words will become a final farewell. Life offers no signal that an ordinary evening is about to divide itself forever into two chapters. Before and after. For the people connected to Butler Crescent, that dividing line was only hours away. Long before their names appeared together in newspaper headlines, they belonged to different families, different circles of friends, and different dreams. The world would eventually remember them collectively as the Brentwood Five, but that collective name can sometimes hide an important truth. They were not a single story. They were 5 individual lives that happened to intersect during one ordinary stage of young adulthood. Each of them carried plans that extended far beyond the spring of 2014. Each of them had people waiting to celebrate future birthdays, graduations, careers, marriages, and countless ordinary moments that would never arrive. University life has a way of bringing strangers together. Students leave hometowns scattered across provinces and countries, arriving on campus with little more than suitcases and uncertainty. Within months, strangers become roommates. Classmates become close friends. Shared meals become traditions. A house becomes more than an address. That was the world surrounding the gathering on Butler Crescent. The people who spent time there were navigating the familiar rhythm of student life. Days were filled with lectures, assignments, part-time jobs, and long evenings preparing for examinations. Nights often belonged to conversations around kitchen tables, spontaneous celebrations after difficult exams, and discussions about where life might lead after graduation. To outsiders, those evenings might have seemed ordinary. To the people living them, they represented a brief period of freedom before adulthood would begin asking different questions. Jordan Segura was remembered by those who knew him as someone whose warmth often made others feel welcome. Friends described a young man who enjoyed being around people and who valued the friendships he had built during his years in Calgary. He had become part of a community that looked forward rather than backward. Conversations were filled with plans instead of regrets, with opportunities instead of endings. Lawrence Hong had built his own path through determination and education. Like many mature students, he understood that every semester represented another step toward goals he had invested years pursuing. Those around him remembered his commitment, his intelligence, and the quiet confidence that came from working steadily toward a future he believed was within reach. Joshua Hunter was another young man standing at the edge of possibility. Friends remembered his sense of humor and the ease with which he connected with people around him. University friendships are often formed under pressure through difficult classes, shared deadlines, and mutual encouragement, and those bonds can become remarkably strong in a short period of time. Joshua was part of that network of friendships that made student life feel less overwhelming. Zachariah Rathwell brought an energy that friends continued to remember long after his death. Every social group has someone whose presence seems to make gatherings feel more complete, someone who contributes not through grand gestures but through countless small moments of laughter, conversation, and companionship. Those memories would later become precious to the people who survived him. Katie Perris was remembered for her kindness and the optimism that often accompanies young adulthood. Like so many students approaching the end of another academic year, she was looking ahead rather than behind. The future appeared open, filled with possibilities that had not yet taken shape. Looking back years later, family photographs carry a different weight. A graduation picture becomes more than a celebration. A birthday photograph becomes more than a memory. An ordinary smile captured by a camera suddenly represents an entire future that disappeared before it had the opportunity to unfold. For the families of the 5 victims, grief did not begin with public attention. It began with unanswered phone calls. With confusion before certainty. With the unimaginable realization that someone they loved would never come home again. The public often encounters tragedies through headlines and breaking news alerts. Families experience them differently. They remember birthdays, favorite meals, holiday traditions, the sound of a familiar laugh, the small habits that no newspaper article could ever fully describe. Those personal memories become the true measure of loss. As news of the killings spread across Calgary, the university community entered a period of profound mourning. Students who had been worrying about examinations only hours earlier suddenly found themselves gathering to comfort one another. Professors, classmates, neighbors, and friends struggled to comprehend how an evening intended to celebrate the end of the semester had ended in such devastating loss. Memorials began to appear. Flowers accumulated. Handwritten messages expressed disbelief alongside sympathy. People who had never met the victims stood beside those who had known them for years, united by the same overwhelming question of how something so extraordinary could happen in a place that had always felt so familiar. The tragedy reached beyond one neighborhood. It touched lecture halls, residence buildings, workplaces, and homes throughout Calgary. It also served as a painful reminder that the impact of violence extends far beyond the immediate victims. Every person who dies leaves behind parents, Siblings, relatives, friends, classmates, colleagues, teachers, and neighbors whose lives are permanently altered. Years later, when anniversaries arrive each April, the names of the 5 victims continue to be spoken together. Not because they should be remembered only for the way they died, but because they deserve to be remembered for the lives they lived before that night. Their ambitions were real. Their friendships were real. Their futures were real. That is the lasting tragedy of the Brentwood Five. The crime ended 5 lives in a matter of minutes, but it also interrupted thousands of conversations that would never be finished, celebrations that would never be held, and dreams that would never have the chance to become reality. Before this story turns to the events of April 15th, it is worth pausing on that simple truth. Behind every major criminal case are human lives that existed long before investigators arrived, long before court proceedings began, and long before history assigned a collective name to an unimaginable loss. Remembering those lives is not separate from understanding the case. It is the reason the case still matters. By the evening of April 14, 2014, the atmosphere inside the house on Butler Crescent reflected something familiar to university students everywhere. The academic year was drawing to a close, final examinations were ending, and the weight that had settled over campus for weeks was beginning to lift. It was not a large party intended to attract attention. Instead, it was a small gathering of friends and acquaintances celebrating the end of another demanding semester. People arrived at different times throughout the evening. Some knew each other well, while others had only met through mutual friends. Conversations drifted naturally from classes and professors to plans for the coming summer. Some discussed jobs they hoped to begin within weeks. Others spoke about graduation, travel, or simply the relief of having survived another examination period. Nothing about the gathering suggested that it would become part of Canadian history. The house itself reflected the ordinary rhythm of shared student accommodation. Coats were left near the entrance. Drinks and snacks were placed on tables without much attention to order. Small groups formed and separated as conversations shifted from room to room. Laughter occasionally echoed through the house before fading into quieter discussions. Among those present was 22-year-old Matthew DeGrood. His attendance did not immediately concern anyone. He had been invited through social connections, and his presence did not stand out from the other guests. There were no widely reported confrontations, no significant disagreements, and no obvious conflict during the evening that investigators later identified as a trigger for what followed. As the hours passed, the gathering gradually slowed. Some guests decided to leave. Others remained behind to continue talking. A few settled into spare rooms or couches, intending to stay the night rather than travel home in the early morning hours. The energy that often accompanies student celebrations slowly gave way to the quiet stillness that arrives after midnight. Outside, Brentwood remained peaceful. Streetlights illuminated empty sidewalks. Occasional passing vehicles broke the silence before disappearing into the distance. The surrounding homes appeared unchanged, their occupants unaware that only a short distance away, a tragedy was beginning to unfold. Investigators would later determine that, during the early hours of April 15th, Matthew DeGrood launched a sudden and unprovoked attack inside the house using a knife. The assault unfolded rapidly. Those present had little opportunity to understand what was happening before the situation became chaotic. Several people attempted to escape the house, while others sought safety or tried to help those around them. In the confusion, emergency services were contacted, but the violence had already caused devastating consequences before police and paramedics could arrive. 5 young people lost their lives that morning. Jordan Segura, Lawrence Hong, Joshua Hunter, Zachariah Rathwell, Katie Perez. Several others survived after escaping the house or avoiding the attack, but many would later carry lasting psychological trauma from witnessing events that defied comprehension. One of the most striking aspects of the investigation emerged almost immediately. Detectives found no evidence that the victims had been specifically targeted because of personal disputes or long-standing hostility. The gathering had begun as an ordinary social event, and investigators found no indication that the evening had been organized with violence in mind. This absence of an identifiable interpersonal motive distinguished the case from many other homicide investigations. For the survivors, reconstructing those minutes proved extraordinarily difficult. Traumatic events often disrupt memory. Individuals may remember isolated moments with remarkable clarity while struggling to place them into a complete timeline. Investigators therefore relied on multiple witness accounts, physical evidence, and forensic examination to establish the sequence of events as accurately as possible. As officers secured the area, another unexpected development occurred. Matthew de Groot did not attempt to flee the city. After leaving the residence, he walked away from the scene. When police located him not far from the neighborhood, he was taken into custody without a prolonged confrontation. That peaceful arrest stood in sharp contrast to the violence that had taken place only a short time earlier. The questions facing investigators therefore changed almost immediately. The identity of the suspect was established quickly. The challenge now became understanding why such an attack had occurred. Initial interviews and subsequent observations suggested that Matthew de Groot was experiencing profound psychological disturbance. According to evidence later presented during legal proceedings, he expressed beliefs indicating that he perceived reality in a fundamentally altered way during the incident. Those statements would become central to the investigation that followed. At first, however, investigators approached the case as they would any major homicide. Every room inside the residence was carefully documented. Witnesses were interviewed separately. Timelines were reconstructed minute by minute. Detectives sought to distinguish verified facts from understandable confusion created by an extraordinarily traumatic event. News of the killings spread quickly across Calgary. By sunrise, police vehicles surrounded the residential street, and media organizations began reporting that multiple fatalities had occurred near the University of Calgary. As additional information emerged throughout the day, the scale of the tragedy became clear. For many residents, disbelief gave way to grief. Brentwood had long been regarded as a quiet community. Violent crime on this scale seemed incompatible with the neighborhood's identity. Students, faculty members, and local residents gathered in shock as details slowly became public. The University of Calgary responded by offering support to students, faculty, and staff affected by the tragedy. Counseling resources were expanded as classmates, roommates, and friends attempted to process an event that had shattered their sense of safety. For investigators, however, the work had only begun. Although the immediate questions surrounding the identity of the suspect had been answered, the deeper questions remained unresolved. Why had a young man with no established history of planned violence suddenly attacked people gathered at a peaceful celebration? Were there warning signs that had gone unnoticed? Had anyone recognized changes in his mental state before that night? Those questions would shape every stage of the investigation. They would eventually lead detectives beyond conventional criminal motives and into extensive psychiatric evaluations that examined Matthew de Groot's mental condition before, during, and after the incident. The answers they uncovered would ultimately transform the case from a straightforward homicide prosecution into one of Canada's most closely watched discussions about severe mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the difficult intersection between public safety and psychiatric care. Before those legal debates began, however, Calgary faced a far more immediate reality. 5 families were preparing funerals instead of graduations. 5 circles of friends found themselves gathering not to celebrate the end of a semester, but to mourn lives that had ended without warning. The ordinary student house on Butler Crescent, once filled with conversations about the future, had become a place forever associated with one of the darkest mornings in the city's history. Dawn in Calgary often arrives quietly, especially in early spring when the cold still lingers in the air and the sky lightens slowly over the prairie horizon. On April 15, 2014, that gradual transition from night to morning carried a weight that no one in the city yet understood. Life across Calgary began in its usual rhythm. People prepared for work, students checked schedules, and traffic slowly returned to the roads as another weekday began. In the neighborhood of Brentwood, however, something was already wrong. The first responders arrived to a scene that immediately signaled the seriousness of the situation. Emergency calls had reported a violent incident inside a residence on Butler Crescent, and officers moving through the area quickly realized that this was not an isolated altercation. The presence of multiple victims transformed the response into a coordinated emergency operation. Paramedics, police units, and support teams converged on the quiet residential street, which only hours earlier had been indistinguishable from any other student neighborhood near the university. The house itself stood unchanged on the outside. Its structure gave no visual indication of what had occurred within. Neighbors, awakened by activity outside, watched from a distance as the street filled with emergency vehicles. For many of them, the scene felt surreal, as if the normal boundaries of their community had been disrupted without warning. Inside the residence, investigators and emergency personnel began the difficult process of assessing the situation. The interior reflected the aftermath of a violent and chaotic event. Rooms that had hosted conversation and gathering the night before now required careful documentation and examination. Every detail became part of a larger effort to understand exactly what had happened during the early morning hours. As the initial assessment continued, it became clear that multiple individuals had suffered fatal injuries. The confirmation of 5 deaths shifted the investigation into one of the most serious categories of criminal response. Protocol required immediate coordination with homicide investigators, forensic teams, and specialized support units. The focus was no longer solely on emergency response, but on preserving evidence that would later be crucial in reconstructing the sequence of events. Outside the house, the atmosphere was marked by silence and disbelief. Police established a perimeter that extended beyond the immediate property, restricting access as investigators worked inside. Residents of Butler Crescent and surrounding streets remained in their homes or gathered at the edges of the cordoned area, trying to understand what had occurred in their neighborhood during the night. News of the incident spread quickly beyond Brentwood. Within hours, it reached university staff, students, and local authorities. The proximity of the residents to the University of Calgary intensified the shock. Many students had attended gatherings in similar houses. Many lived in nearby neighborhoods. The idea that such violence could occur so close to their daily environment disrupted any sense of separation between ordinary life and tragedy. As investigators began to identify the victims, the human scale of the event became clearer. 5 young adults had been killed. Each name represented a personal history, a family connection, and a set of relationships that extended far beyond the walls of the house. The process of confirming identities was carried out with care, recognizing the impact that notification would have on families who had not yet received official information. At the same time, attention turned to locating and securing the suspect. Matthew de Grood had already been taken into custody shortly after leaving the scene. His arrest, carried out without significant resistance, allowed investigators to focus on establishing a timeline and understanding the circumstances that led to the incident. He was transported to police custody for questioning, where his condition and statements became part of the early investigative record. Inside the house, forensic teams began their detailed work. Every room was examined systematically. Evidence was catalogued, photographed, and collected according to standard procedures designed to preserve the integrity of the investigation. The goal was not only to document the physical environment, but to reconstruct the sequence of events that had taken place within it during the critical early morning hours. Witness statements were gathered from those who had survived or escaped the residence. Their accounts varied in detail, as is common in traumatic situations, but together they provided a fragmented yet essential understanding of how the situation unfolded from the perspective of those present. Investigators worked carefully to align these accounts with physical evidence, recognizing that memory under extreme stress can be both vivid and incomplete. As the morning progressed, the scale of the tragedy became fully apparent to law enforcement officials. 5 deaths in a single residential setting near a major university represented an unprecedented event in the city's recent history. Command structures were adjusted accordingly, ensuring that the investigation received the highest level of coordination and support. By mid-morning, the neighborhood had become the center of national attention. Media organizations arrived in increasing numbers, setting up equipment at a distance from the police perimeter. Reports began to circulate across Canada, and the story quickly moved from local tragedy to national news. The combination of young victims, a university setting, and the unexpected nature of the attack contributed to widespread public shock. Yet behind the growing media coverage, the immediate focus remained on the families of the victims. Police officers and support personnel began the difficult process of notification. Each conversation carried the same weight of irreversible change. Families who had begun their day expecting normal routines were instead confronted with news that would permanently alter their lives. Within the investigation itself, early findings did not indicate a conventional motive. There were no signs of planned targeting, no evidence of pre-existing conflict among the individuals involved that would explain the violence in traditional terms. This absence of a clear interpersonal cause immediately shifted attention toward other possible explanations, including the mental state of the suspect. As the day continued, Matthew DeGroode's behavior and statements became a significant area of focus. His initial comments to medical and law enforcement personnel suggested a distorted perception of reality during the incident. These early observations would later be examined in detail by psychiatric professionals, forming a central component of the legal proceedings that followed. For investigators, however, the priority remained establishing a reliable factual foundation. The physical evidence inside the house, combined with witness testimony and forensic analysis, formed the basis of a timeline that would later be presented in court. Each element needed to be verified, cross-referenced, and preserved for future examination. Outside the immediate scope of the investigation, the city of Calgary began to process the emotional impact of what had occurred. Universities, community organizations, and public institutions responded with statements of support and condolence. Counseling services were made available, and spaces for collective mourning began to emerge. As the first full day after the incident came to a close, the house on Butler Crescent stood under police supervision, no longer simply a student residence but the central location of a case that would soon draw national and international attention. Inside, investigators continued their careful work, knowing that every detail gathered in those early hours would play a crucial role in understanding how an ordinary night had ended in irreversible loss. The discovery phase of the investigation had revealed the scale of the tragedy. What remained was the far more complex task of explaining how it had become possible. In the hours and days following the incident on Butler Crescent, the investigation in Calgary entered a phase defined by urgency and uncertainty. With 5 lives lost and a suspect already in custody, the central challenge was no longer identifying who had committed the crime, but understanding how and why it had occurred in the first place. In cases of mass violence, the early investigative period is often the most critical, because it is during this window that physical evidence is most intact, memories are still fresh, and the first coherent narrative of events begins to take shape. The Calgary Police Service assembled a specialized homicide investigation team, supported by forensic analysts, crime scene technicians, and behavioral experts. The residence where the incident took place remained under strict control. Every entry point was monitored, and access was limited to authorized personnel wearing protective equipment. The goal was to preserve the integrity of the scene while ensuring that all relevant evidence could be documented without contamination or loss. Inside the house, investigators worked methodically through each room. The environment itself told a fragmented story. Furniture placement, personal belongings, and traces of activity from the previous night were all examined in detail. Nothing was assumed. Everything required verification. Even the smallest object could become relevant when reconstructing the sequence of events that had unfolded in the early morning hours. Forensic documentation followed a strict process. Photographs were taken before any object was moved. Measurements were recorded to establish spatial relationships between rooms and movement patterns. Evidence was catalogued in a way that allowed later reconstruction in both physical and digital form. This level of detail was necessary not only for the criminal investigation but also for the legal proceedings that would eventually follow. At the same time, investigators began conducting interviews with survivors and witnesses. These interviews were handled with care, recognizing the psychological trauma experienced by those who had been present during the incident. Each account was recorded separately to avoid cross-contamination of memory. Investigators understood that in traumatic situations, recollections can be inconsistent, but when multiple accounts are compared, patterns often emerge that help clarify what actually occurred. The statements provided by survivors described a sudden and unexpected shift in the atmosphere inside the residence. According to these accounts, the evening had been ordinary and social in nature before rapidly descending into chaos during the early morning hours. The speed at which the situation changed became a key focus of the investigation, as it suggested a lack of prolonged confrontation or escalation prior to the violence. Parallel to the physical investigation, attention was directed toward the suspect, Matthew DeGrood. Following his arrest near the neighborhood, he was taken into custody and subjected to initial questioning. His condition at the time of detention and his early statements to authorities were documented carefully. These early interactions were not treated as a full confession or explanation, but as preliminary observations that could later inform psychiatric and legal evaluations. One of the earliest complexities encountered by investigators was the absence of a clear conventional motive. There was no evidence indicating financial gain, personal revenge, or organized intent. The individuals present at the residence appeared to have been connected primarily through social and academic relationships. This lack of an identifiable trigger forced investigators to broaden the scope of their inquiry beyond traditional homicide frameworks. As a result, behavioral analysis became an important component of the case. Specialists reviewed the suspect's background, recent activities, and known social interactions in an effort to identify any patterns of behavior that might provide context. However, initial findings did not reveal any clear history of violent planning or targeted aggression toward the victims. This absence of external motive gradually shifted attention toward internal psychological factors. During early interactions with medical personnel, Matthew DeGrood reportedly expressed beliefs and perceptions that suggested a significant break from shared reality. These observations were documented and later formed the basis for more extensive psychiatric evaluation ordered by the court system. The investigation also included a detailed reconstruction of the timeline leading up to the incident. This process involved combining witness statements, digital records, and forensic evidence to establish a minute-by-minute sequence of events. Investigators worked to determine when each individual arrived at the residence, how the gathering evolved over the course of the evening, and how the transition from social interaction to violence occurred during the early morning hours. Digital evidence, including communication records, was reviewed to identify any relevant interactions prior to the incident. At the same time, physical evidence from the scene was analyzed in laboratories to confirm findings from the residents. Each piece of information was compared against witness accounts to build a consistent narrative. As the investigation progressed, the broader community response became an additional factor. Public attention intensified rapidly, placing pressure on law enforcement to provide answers while maintaining the integrity of the case. However, investigators emphasized that premature conclusions could compromise both legal proceedings and the accuracy of the final reconstruction. The families of the victims were also central to the investigative process. Police maintained regular communication with them, providing updates as information became available. At the same time, care was taken to ensure that the release of information did not interfere with ongoing forensic work or judicial requirements. The balance between transparency and investigative necessity became a constant consideration. Within days, it became clear that the case would extend beyond a standard criminal trial. The psychological condition of the suspect introduced legal questions related to criminal responsibility and mental health. These questions required formal evaluation by forensic psychiatrists, who were tasked with determining whether the accused was capable of understanding the nature and consequences of his actions at the time of the incident. This stage of the investigation marked a transition from purely factual reconstruction to interpretive analysis. It was no longer sufficient to know what had happened. The legal system required an understanding of intent, awareness, and mental state, all of which are central to determining criminal liability in cases involving severe psychological disturbance. Throughout this process, investigators remained focused on maintaining objectivity. The emotional weight of the case was significant, particularly given the age of the victims and the proximity of the event to a university community. However, the integrity of the investigation depended on careful adherence to evidence-based procedures rather than emotional interpretation. By the time the initial investigative phase began to conclude, a clearer but still incomplete picture had emerged. The physical evidence confirmed the occurrence of a sudden and violent event inside the residence. Witness accounts provided fragmented but consistent descriptions of chaos and urgency. The suspect's behavior and statements indicated a significant departure from shared reality during the incident. What remained unresolved was the legal interpretation of those findings. That question would move from the hands of investigators to the courts, where psychiatric evaluations, legal arguments, and judicial standards would determine how responsibility would ultimately be defined. The investigation had established the facts of what occurred inside the house on Butler Crescent. The next phase would determine how those facts would be understood within the framework of law and mental health, and whether the justice system would classify the event as criminal intent or the result of severe psychological disorder. In many criminal investigations, breakthroughs arrive through a single decisive piece of evidence, a confession, a forensic match, or a witness who suddenly recalls a crucial detail. In the case of the Brentwood Five, the turning point was not a dramatic revelation but a gradual convergence of medical, psychological, and investigative findings that began to reshape the entire understanding of what had occurred on Butler Crescent. As the investigation moved from the crime scene into the courtroom preparation phase, attention increasingly shifted toward the mental state of Matthew DeGrood at the time of the incident. While the physical evidence had already established the sequence of events inside the residence, it could not answer the central legal question that would define the outcome of the case: whether the accused had been operating with a mind capable of understanding reality in a legally meaningful way. To address this question, the court ordered comprehensive psychiatric evaluations conducted by forensic specialists. These assessments were designed to examine not only the suspect's condition in the days following the incident, but also his mental state leading up to and during the event itself. The process involved extensive interviews, behavioral observations, and review of collateral information provided by family, medical professionals, and law enforcement records. What emerged from these evaluations was a consistent clinical picture that pointed toward a severe psychotic episode. According to the findings presented later in court, DeGrood experienced a profound break from reality characterized by delusional beliefs and distorted perceptions of those around him. He reported thoughts that indicated he perceived the individuals at the gathering not as friends or acquaintances, but as entities he believed posed a threat to him. These perceptions were not isolated or momentary. The psychiatric assessments suggested that they were part of a broader pattern of psychosis that had developed over time, culminating in a complete detachment from consensual reality during the incident. The clinical terminology used to describe this condition was schizophrenia, a serious mental disorder that can, in acute phases, significantly impair a person's ability to distinguish between real and imagined threats. For investigators and legal professionals, this information represented a fundamental shift in the case. Until this point, the focus had been on reconstructing actions and establishing accountability through evidence and testimony. With the introduction of psychiatric findings, the central issue expanded to include questions of intent, awareness, and capacity. The legal system in Canada recognizes a specific standard for criminal responsibility in cases involving mental disorder. Under this framework, a person may be found not criminally responsible if, at the time of the offense, they were suffering from a mental condition that rendered them incapable of appreciating the nature or quality of their actions or knowing that their actions were wrong. This standard does not deny that the act occurred, nor does it minimize its consequences. Instead, it addresses whether the individual possessed the mental capacity required for criminal liability. As the psychiatric evidence was reviewed, it became clear that this legal threshold would become central to the court's deliberation. The defense and prosecution both engaged expert witnesses to interpret the findings, each presenting different perspectives on how the accused's mental state should be understood within the context of the law. The defense argued that the evidence supported a diagnosis of acute psychosis at the time of the incident, emphasizing the severity of the delusional state and its impact on perception and decision-making. The prosecution, while not disputing the presence of mental illness, focused on the legal implications of behavior during the incident and the need to carefully assess whether the standard for non-responsibility had been fully met. Throughout this process, the voices of the victims' families remained a powerful presence in the background of the proceedings. For them, the introduction of psychiatric explanations did not reduce the reality of their loss. It introduced a different kind of struggle, one that involved reconciling the absence of motive with the permanence of grief. As expert testimony accumulated, a clearer picture of the suspect's mental condition began to form. The evaluations consistently described a state of severe psychosis, marked by hallucinations, paranoid delusions, and a distorted interpretation of external reality. In this condition, ordinary social interactions could be misinterpreted as threatening, and familiar environments could be perceived as dangerous or hostile. One of the most significant aspects of the breakthrough was the timing of these symptoms. Medical experts and witnesses indicated that the deterioration in mental state was acute rather than gradual in a way that would have been easily observable to others. This raised important questions about detectability and intervention, particularly in cases where individuals may not exhibit clear outward signs of psychosis until a critical threshold is reached. For the court, this created a complex evidentiary landscape. On one hand, there was clear documentation of a violent event with irreversible consequences. On the other hand, there was substantial psychiatric evidence suggesting that the individual responsible may have been experiencing a complete break from reality at the time. This tension between legal responsibility and medical explanation became the defining feature of the case. It required the court to navigate not only factual evidence but also the boundaries between law and psychiatry, two systems that often intersect but do not always align in their interpretation of human behavior. As proceedings advanced, it became increasingly apparent that the case would likely result in a ruling centered on criminal responsibility rather than traditional conviction and sentencing. The psychiatric consensus, combined with behavioral evidence from the time of the incident, pointed toward a conclusion that the accused was operating under a severe mental disorder that significantly impaired his perception of reality. This realization represented the true turning point in the case. It did not change what had happened on Butler Crescent, nor did it alter the outcome for the victims and their families. However, it fundamentally changed how the justice system would categorize and respond to the event. The breakthrough in this case was therefore not a single piece of evidence or testimony. It was the gradual emergence of a unified understanding across medical, psychological, and legal disciplines that the incident could not be fully explained through conventional criminal intent. Instead, it existed at the intersection of tragedy and mental illness, forcing the justice system to confront questions that extend beyond guilt and punishment into the complex relationship between human cognition, responsibility, and the limits of legal interpretation. By the time the case moved toward its conclusion in court, the direction had been set. The remaining phase would not be about determining whether the act occurred, but about defining how the law should respond to a mind that, according to expert consensus, had lost its connection to reality at the moment everything changed. When the case of the Brentwood Five reached the courtroom, the tone of the proceedings was fundamentally different from what many members of the public typically associate with criminal trials involving mass violence. Because from the outset the central issue was not a dispute over identity or the basic facts of what had occurred inside the house on Butler Crescent, which had already been established through extensive forensic work and witness testimony, but rather the legal interpretation of the mental state of Matthew DeGrood at the time of the incident, and whether that mental state met the threshold required under Canadian law for criminal responsibility. A question that shifted the focus of the trial away from motive and toward psychiatric evaluation, expert interpretation, and the complex intersection between law and mental health, and as the proceedings began, the courtroom itself reflected this unusual structure. With legal counsel on both sides relying heavily on psychiatric reports, clinical assessments, and expert witnesses rather than competing narratives of intent or planning. Because there was no evidence presented of premeditated targeting or interpersonal conflict that could explain the violence in conventional terms. And instead the trial became an examination of how a severe psychotic episode can alter perception to the extent that an individual may no longer accurately interpret reality. A concept that courts must evaluate not only medically but within strict legal definitions that determine responsibility and accountability. And throughout the proceedings the defense maintained that the accused was suffering from a profound break with reality consistent with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, supported by forensic psychiatric evaluations that described delusions, hallucinations, and a distorted perception of threat that, according to expert testimony, significantly impaired his ability to distinguish between real and imagined danger, while the Crown acknowledged the presence of mental illness but emphasized the need for the court to carefully apply the legal standard, which requires determining whether the accused was capable of understanding the nature and quality of his actions or knowing that they were wrong at the time they occurred, a distinction that is central to Canadian criminal law regarding mental disorder, and as expert witnesses were called. The courtroom heard detailed clinical interpretations that described the nature of psychosis not as a temporary emotional disturbance but as a severe disruption of cognitive functioning that can fundamentally alter how external stimuli are perceived and interpreted, and these explanations, while clinically precise, carried profound implications when applied to the events of that morning, because they suggested that the actions in question occurred within a mental framework that did not align with shared reality, creating a legal challenge that required the court to balance compassion for mental illness with the need to acknowledge the irreversible harm caused by the actions that took place, and throughout this process the families of the victims were present in the broader context of the proceedings, their experiences forming a silent but powerful counterpoint to the technical language of psychiatric evaluation, because for them the central reality of the case remained unchanged regardless of legal classification. 5 lives had been lost and 5 families had been permanently altered. And the courtroom proceedings represented not a debate over whether tragedy had occurred but an attempt to determine how the justice system should categorize and respond to it, and as the trial progressed toward its conclusion, the evidence presented by both sides converged on a consistent clinical picture of severe mental disorder at the time of the incident, with multiple expert assessments supporting the conclusion that the accused had experienced a psychotic episode that significantly impaired his perception of reality, and this convergence of medical opinion became a decisive factor in the court's reasoning. Because under Canadian law the standard for not criminally responsible due to mental disorder requires not only the presence of mental illness but also a direct impact on the individual's capacity to appreciate the nature of their actions or understand that those actions were wrong. And in delivering its decision in 2016, the court ultimately found that Matthew de Groot met this legal threshold, resulting in a verdict of not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder. A finding that did not constitute an acquittal in the ordinary sense, but rather a legal determination that shifted the framework of accountability from punitive sentencing to psychiatric treatment under secure medical supervision, and this outcome meant that instead of a prison sentence, the accused would be placed under the authority of a psychiatric review board responsible for determining treatment, risk level, and conditions of confinement, with periodic reassessments to evaluate progress and potential reintegration into society under controlled circumstances. And the announcement of this decision marked one of the most contentious aspects of the entire case, because while the legal reasoning was grounded in established statutory standards and supported by expert psychiatric evidence, it also raised difficult questions in public discourse about the relationship between mental illness and criminal accountability, particularly in cases involving extreme violence, and for the families of the victims the ruling introduced a different kind of challenge, because it required them to process a conclusion that acknowledged mental disorder as the determining factor in legal responsibility while leaving intact the reality of their loss. And in the years that followed the case continued to be referenced in discussions across Canada regarding the NCRMD system, psychiatric care for individuals involved in serious violent incidents, and the broader question of how societies define justice when the traditional concepts of intent and culpability are complicated by severe mental illness, and although the legal proceedings formally concluded with the court's decision, the broader implications of the case extended far beyond the courtroom, influencing public debate, policy discussions, and ongoing reflection within both legal and psychiatric communities about the limits and responsibilities of each system when confronted with cases that exist at the intersection of tragedy and mental disorder. In the months and years following the conclusion of the court proceedings, the case of the Brentwood Five slowly transitioned from an active legal matter into a lasting point of reflection within Canadian society, but for the families directly affected. That transition existed only in the public sphere, because in private life the consequences of April 15, 2014 remained unchanged and irreversible, and the absence of the 5 victims continued to define every day that followed, shaping family routines, holidays, anniversaries, and the quiet ordinary moments that once would have been shared with them. And as time moved forward, the house on Butler Crescent gradually returned to being just a physical structure within a residential neighborhood, yet for those who knew what had occurred there, it remained permanently marked by memory, a place that symbolized not only the violence of a single night but also the sudden fragility of everyday life, and within the broader Calgary community, the initial shock that had followed the incident slowly evolved into remembrance and reflection. With memorial gatherings held to honor the lives of Jordan Segura, Lawrence Hong, Joshua Hunter, Zachariah Rathwell, and Katie Perris, whose names became collectively recognized as the Brentwood Five. Not as a reduction of their identities but as a shared symbol of loss that connected their individual stories into a single moment of collective mourning, and each year on the anniversary of the tragedy, their families, friends, and members of the community continued to come together in remembrance, reaffirming that their lives extended far beyond the circumstances of their deaths, and within the University of Calgary, the impact of the event continued to resonate long after the initial response had ended, influencing conversations about student safety, mental health awareness, and the importance of recognizing early signs of psychological distress, while counseling services and support systems that were strengthened in the aftermath became a lasting part of the institution's response to student well-being, and in the legal and psychiatric fields. The case remained a frequently referenced example in discussions about the not criminally responsible framework in Canada, particularly in relation to how courts interpret severe psychotic episodes and their impact on criminal intent. And these discussions often returned to the central tension highlighted by the case, which is the need to balance public safety, legal accountability, and medical understanding in situations where mental illness plays a decisive role in violent behavior. And although Matthew de Grood was placed under psychiatric supervision following the NCRMD ruling, with ongoing assessments conducted by mental health review authorities to determine treatment progress and risk status, the broader public conversation continued to grapple with the implications of his case, reflecting differing perspectives on justice, responsibility, and rehabilitation, and over time the intensity of media attention decreased, but the case did not disappear from collective memory, instead becoming part of a broader national dialogue about how societies respond to rare but devastating incidents where mental illness and violence intersect. And for many observers, the most enduring aspect of the Brentwood Five case was not only the legal outcome or the clinical explanations provided in court, but the recognition that 5 young lives had been interrupted in a moment that began as an ordinary gathering among friends. A reminder that tragedy can emerge without warning in spaces that feel familiar and safe, and that understanding such events requires not only legal and medical analysis but also a sustained commitment to remembering the individuals whose futures were taken from them. And in that sense, the legacy of the Brentwood Five continues not through the details of the case alone, but through the ongoing efforts of families and communities to preserve the memory of those lost, to support one another through grief that does not follow a clear timeline, and to ensure that the names behind the headlines remain connected to the lives they lived rather than only the night that changed everything. And as years continue to pass, the story remains part of Calgary's collective history, not as a conclusion, but as an ongoing reminder of loss, resilience, and the complex ways in which justice, memory, and human vulnerability intersect in the aftermath of irreversible tragedy. The case of the Brentwood Five ultimately remains one of the most studied and discussed incidents in modern Canadian criminal and legal history, not because of any mystery surrounding the identity of the perpetrator or the basic sequence of events, which were established early in the investigation, but because of the difficult questions it raised about mental illness, legal responsibility, and the limits of how justice systems interpret human behavior under conditions of severe psychological breakdown. And while the court's NCRMD ruling in 2016 provided a legal resolution within the framework of Canadian law, it did not resolve the emotional reality carried by the families of Jordan Segura, Lawrence Hong, Joshua Hunter, Zachariah Rathwell, and Katie Perris. whose absence continues to define their loved ones' lives, and over time the case has come to represent both a tragedy of irreversible loss and a focal point for ongoing public discussion about psychiatric care, early intervention, and the challenge of identifying psychosis before it escalates into catastrophe. While memorial efforts and annual remembrances in Calgary ensure that the 5 victims are remembered not only as names associated with a single night of violence but as individuals whose futures were taken from them in the midst of ordinary life. And as years pass, the story continues to be revisited in legal, medical, and community contexts as a reminder that behind every case file and courtroom decision are real people, real families, and consequences that extend far beyond the boundaries of any single judgment or explanation. What remains after a case like the Brentwood Five is not a single conclusion, but a layering of different truths that continue to exist side by side without ever fully resolving into one unified explanation. Because in the legal sense the case has already reached its endpoint through the NCRMD ruling that placed Matthew de Groot under psychiatric care rather than criminal punishment, yet in the human sense there is no endpoint at all, only continuation in the form of absence, memory, and the ongoing effort of families and communities to live alongside something that cannot be changed or reversed. In the immediate aftermath of the court's decision, public reaction reflected a familiar tension that often appears in cases involving severe mental illness and extreme violence. Where one part of society seeks clarity through legal classification while another part struggles with the emotional weight of outcomes that do not align neatly with traditional ideas of justice, and this tension did not resolve with time, but instead became a permanent part of how the case is discussed in Canada, especially in legal, psychiatric, and academic contexts where it is frequently referenced as an example of the limits of criminal responsibility when psychosis is severe enough to fundamentally distort perception of reality. Yet even within those structured discussions, the case always returns to something simpler and more difficult at the same time, which is the fact that 5 young people lost their lives during what began as an ordinary social gathering among university students. And that this transition from normalcy to irreversible loss occurred within a time frame so short that it continues to defy intuitive understanding, because there was no long development of conflict, no extended escalation visible to those around, and no publicly known grievance that could have foreshadowed what was about to happen, which is precisely why the case remains so difficult to integrate into typical narratives about crime. Over the years, the names Jordan Segura, Lawrence Hong, Joshua Hunter, Zachariah Rathwell, and Kaiti Peris have remained present within the Calgary community not as abstract identifiers within a legal record, but as individuals whose lives were interrupted at a point where they were still actively unfolding, still forming plans, relationships, and identities that had not yet reached completion, and this incompleteness is part of what gives the case its lasting emotional weight, because it forces anyone engaging with it to confront the idea that human lives are not only defined by what they become, but also by what they are prevented from becoming. Within the University of Calgary, the incident also became part of institutional memory, influencing ongoing conversations about student safety, mental health awareness, and the importance of recognizing psychological distress in its earliest stages. Not because such recognition can guarantee prevention in every case, but because it represents one of the few points at which intervention is still possible before crisis reaches irreversible outcomes. And in this sense, the legacy of the case extends beyond legal discourse into public health and community responsibility, where it continues to be referenced in discussions about how institutions respond to students experiencing severe mental health challenges. At the same time, the psychiatric dimension of the case continues to be analyzed within clinical and forensic psychology, particularly in relation to how acute psychotic episodes can alter perception so significantly that an individual may misinterpret social environments as threatening or hostile. And while these clinical explanations provide a framework for understanding behavior, they also raise ongoing ethical and philosophical questions about responsibility, agency, and the extent to which law can or should accommodate conditions that fundamentally disrupt a person's connection to shared reality. However, none of these analytical frameworks fully absorb the emotional reality experienced by the families of the victims, for whom the case is not a subject of academic or legal categorization, but a lived absence that persists across time in everyday moments that would otherwise have been shared. And this distinction between systemic interpretation and personal grief is one of the most important aspects of understanding why cases like this continue to resonate long after formal proceedings have ended. As time passes, public attention naturally fades, and the urgency that surrounds breaking news is replaced by quieter forms of remembrance. But in cases such as this, memory does not disappear, it stabilizes into something more permanent, expressed through anniversaries, memorials, and personal acts of remembrance that ensure the individuals involved are not reduced solely to the moment of tragedy, but are instead remembered as complete human beings whose lives held meaning beyond the circumstances of their deaths. The house on Butler Crescent, like many physical sites of tragedy, eventually returns to its ordinary function within a residential neighborhood, yet for those who know its history, it remains permanently marked in perception. A reminder that ordinary spaces can contain extraordinary ruptures in continuity, and that safety is often something assumed rather than consciously recognized until it is disrupted. In the broader national context, the Brentwood 5 case continues to be referenced in discussions about the NCRMD framework, particularly in debates about how the justice system should respond when severe mental illness is present in violent crime. And these discussions often reveal a fundamental tension between two necessary but sometimes competing priorities, which are the protection of society and the appropriate treatment of individuals experiencing profound psychiatric conditions. And the case remains significant because it does not allow for easy prioritization of one over the other without acknowledging the complexity involved. Ultimately, what the case leaves behind is not a singular moral lesson or a definitive explanation, but a set of enduring questions about how societies define responsibility, how they respond to mental illness in its most severe forms, and how they remember individuals whose lives are lost in circumstances that defy simple categorization. And in this space between understanding and incomprehension, the memory of the Brentwood 5 continues to exist, not as a closed narrative, but as an ongoing reflection on fragility, consequence, and the limits of certainty in the face of irreversible human loss.